The reading had already begun by the time Henry understood what he was holding. He stood at the low wooden lectern Diana had positioned near the tall windows, the ones that looked out over the wet street 4 floors below, and the book was open in his hands to page 1. 14 people sat in a loose crescent around him, wine glasses catching the amber light of the wall sconces Diana had turned on in place of the overhead fluorescents. The room smelled of furniture wax and the particular kind of quiet that gathers when people are performing their attention. And Henry read. His voice was steady and level, the voice he used when reading copy aloud to check its rhythm, and the first sentence moved through him like a memory arriving before its context. He kept reading. He knew the sentence, not in the way you know a line you have admired, in the way you know a sentence you wrote at 11 at night on a Tuesday in February, when the radiator in your apartment was knocking and you had a cup of tea you had forgotten, and the sentence arrived because you needed it to, and you wrote it down before it could leave. He kept his eyes on the page. 14 people were watching him, and the man whose name was printed on the cover was sitting in the second chair from the left, and Henry had spoken 6 sentences aloud before he understood that every single one of them was his. 3 years earlier, Henry Mitchell had needed money badly enough to sign a document he had read 3 times and understood completely. He had been working at Caldwell Press for 2 years at that point, a junior manuscript editor in a department of 6, housed on the 4th floor of a narrow building in a part of the city where the rents had not yet finished climbing. His title was Associate Editor, Acquisition Support, which meant he read other people's manuscripts, wrote coverage notes, caught continuity errors, and occasionally improved a sentence so quietly that the author never noticed it had been changed. He was good at it. He was patient and precise, and he had the rare quality of genuinely caring whether a book was the best version of itself, even when the author did not share that concern. Diana Hartley was his supervising editor. She had been at Caldwell for 11 years, long enough to have the corner office, the institutional memory, and the particular authority that comes from having outlasted 2 editorial directors and survived a parent company acquisition without losing her title. She wore her dark hair pulled back and her reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she managed her department the way she managed a manuscript, which was to say she looked for problems and marked them and expected them to be corrected before she saw the pages again. She was not unkind in the way a cartoon villain is unkind. She was efficient. Her efficiency happened to require that she never wonder, even briefly, whether the people doing the correcting had thoughts of their own worth hearing. Henry had been in her department for 2 years before she learned his last name. He knew this because she had used it accidentally in a department meeting, checking a copy schedule, and there was a small pause after it left her mouth that told him it had surprised her. He did not hold it against her. He had long since decided that holding things against people was a kind of storage problem he could not afford. The manuscript he had been asked to write came through a channel he had not expected. A literary agency had contacted Caldwell's acquisitions department with a project from Callum Voss, an author with a mid-list reputation and a long gap since his last book. The project was described as a contemporary literary novel with commercial potential. The actual situation conveyed in a secondary conversation Henry was brought into by accident, because Diana had been in a meeting and someone needed an editorial opinion, was that Callum had a story, a structure, and a name, and he needed someone who could write. Henry had been in that secondary conversation because Petra Wynne, the junior copy editor who worked 2 desks from his, had poked her head into his cubicle and said, "Diana wants someone to sit in, and you are the only one available." Petra was 26 and still in the phase of her career where she assumed that being asked to sit in on things was an honor. Henry had gone with her because there was nothing else to do. The conversation was short. The project was explained to him under the assumption that he would treat it as a professional matter, not a personal one. The agreement would be confidential. The fee was fixed. He would receive no cover credit, no acknowledgement, no contractual right to claim the work. He would write the novel. Callum Voss would publish it. Henry had said he needed to think about it. He thought about it for 4 days. His sister had been in the hospital for 6 weeks at that point, a long and expensive hospitalization that his family was managing the way families manage expenses they cannot cover, which is to say, not very well. The fee for the ghostwriting work was enough to close the gap between what the insurance covered and what the hospital was asking for. He knew this because he had done the arithmetic twice. He signed the agreement on a Thursday afternoon. He sat at the small table in his apartment and read the document a third time, noted the clause that specified he waived any claim to authorship in perpetuity, and signed his name. He had, in that moment, the feeling of a person making a clear-eyed decision under conditions that did not give him a better option. He did not blame the conditions. He signed. He wrote the novel over 7 months. He worked on it in the evenings and on weekends, at the small table or sometimes at the library branch, 3 blocks from his apartment, when the walls of his room felt too close. He wrote about a young woman returning to a coastal town after her mother's death, about the weight of other people's grief, about the particular way a house holds the shape of the person who is no longer in it. He had not intended to write about any of those things. He had intended to write a competent commercial literary novel that would satisfy the agreement's scope. What arrived instead was something he recognized as real. He filed the completed manuscript 11 months after signing. He received payment in 2 installments, the second of which arrived 3 weeks after his sister was discharged from the hospital. He never spoke about it to anyone. He went back to his desk at Caldwell, read other people's manuscripts, wrote coverage notes, and caught continuity errors in prose that was not as good as what he had written alone at the small table. And he said nothing. The book was published 14 months after he submitted the manuscript. It came out under Callum's name with a cover that Henry had not been consulted about, and a jacket copy that described Callum as a singular literary voice. It received 7 reviews in major outlets. 5 of them used the word devastating. One of them quoted the sentence Henry had written at 11 at night on a Tuesday in February, the one with the knocked radiator and the forgotten tea, and called it the kind of sentence that lands in the reader like a stone dropped in still water. And Henry had read that sentence in his apartment on a Saturday morning and sat with it for a long time. The book had been on the Harwich Prize longlist for 6 weeks. That was why Callum Voss was sitting in Diana's salon. The salon was Diana's invention, a quarterly event she organised for authors, agents, and literary press contacts, held in the Caldwell conference room she had furnished over 2 years, with a reading chair, the sconce lighting, a sideboard for wine, and the low lectern near the windows. She called it an informal gathering, which was the kind of description that meant formal in every way that mattered. Being invited was a signal. Being assigned to serve the evening was not. Henry had been assigned to manage the evening's logistics, which meant he had confirmed the catering order, arranged the chairs, set out the copies of the book, and been given a printout of the reading schedule. His name appeared once on the printout next to the instruction. Opening reading, approximately 15 minutes, pages 1 through 4. Diana had marked it in red pen. She had not asked whether he was available. She had not asked whether he wanted to. He had arrived early because that was what the logistics required. He was carrying a box of name cards for the sideboard table when he heard the elevator open and a man stepped out holding a leather messenger bag and a manuscript that had come loose at the bottom, pages fanning toward the lobby floor. Henry set down the box. He crossed to the elevator alcove and gathered the pages from the floor, 3 of them, and handed them back without being asked, checking the corners to make sure the order was right before he let go. The man took them with a brief, specific look, Not the distracted thanks of someone accepting a service, but the direct look of someone who was paying attention. "Thank you," the man said. "The pages go 42, 43, 44, Henry said, because he had checked. The man looked down at the pages and then back up. There was a small pause. "So they do," he said. Henry picked up his box and carried it down the hall. He did not think about the exchange again until later, because there was no reason to think about it. People dropped things. He picked them up. That was the shape of that. It was Petra who leaned over to him 20 minutes later when the guests had begun arriving and Henry was counting wine glasses by the sideboard and said, "That's Callum Voss, by the window." And Henry had looked up and seen the man from the elevator standing in a pool of sconce light, and understood that he was the man whose name was on the cover of the book Henry had written. He had not known what Callum looked like. He had imagined, when he thought about it at all, someone older. The man by the window was perhaps 40, with the kind of posture that comes from having occupied rooms professionally for a long time. He was listening to someone. A literary agent Henry recognized from the acquisitions floor, and he was listening the way a person listens when they are genuinely attending to what is being said, rather than waiting for their turn to speak. Henry counted the last of the wine glasses and made a note on his clipboard. He had wondered sometimes whether Callum would ever want to meet the person who had written the book. He had concluded that wanting and doing were two different things, and that the agreement had settled the question of what got done. Diana opened the evening at 7:45. She stood at the centre of the room in a dark green dress and spoke about the Harwich long list and about Callum's contribution to contemporary literary fiction in phrases that were warm and specific and bore the polish of having been written in advance. The guests held their wine glasses and nodded in the way people nod when they agree and want the speaker to know they agree. Callum sat in the second chair from the left and did not perform modesty, which Henry noted as the behaviour of someone who did not need to perform it. Diana introduced the opening reading by saying that they were fortunate to have someone from the press's own editorial team to give voice to the work, framing it as a mark of how deeply the text had been engaged with in-house. This was not true in the way she meant it. Henry was there because the logistics printout had a slot that needed filling, and Henry had been available. He understood this. He carried the book to the lectern. He opened it to page 1. He began reading. The first sentence was the one about the morning light coming through the kitchen window of the house on Briar Lane, the particular quality of it in late October, how it fell across the countertop at an angle that changed the colour of the wood from brown to something closer to copper, and how the woman standing at the sink noticed this every morning without ever deciding to notice it. Henry had written that sentence on a Saturday in early November at the library, after watching the light come through the high windows of the reading room and thinking about the word copper. He read it now and heard it in the same register in which he had written it, which was not the register of a man performing a text, but of a man recognizing a landscape. He kept his eyes on the page. He turned to page 2. The paragraph about the silence of a house after someone has left it for the last time, the specific sound of air in rooms that no longer have a person in them to absorb it, the way a closed door at the end of a hallway looks different when you know no one will open it from the other side. He had written that paragraph 3 times before it was right. The first version had been too literal, all concrete nouns, and it had felt like a room with no light. The second had gone too far the other way, reaching for an abstraction it hadn't earned. The third had found the balance he wanted, the weight of a real observation, the precision of a sentence that knew exactly what it meant. He read it aloud. His voice did not change. The room was quiet in a way it had not been when he began. He registered this without looking up, the way you register a change in a room's atmosphere through the quality of the silence rather than through any audible evidence. He was nearing the bottom of page 3 when he heard Diana's voice. He should not have been able to hear her. She was standing near the doorway to the corridor, where there was a small alcove with a coat rack and a second sideboard, and she was speaking to someone in what she likely believed was a private register. But the door to the alcove was partially open, and the salon had gone quiet for the reading, and sound travels in a quiet room in ways that the speaker does not account for. Diana was speaking to a man Henry recognized as Martin Cole, the press's publicity director. He could hear them without being able to see them. "He's a competent reader," Diana said. "He's a perfectly competent reader. That's the ceiling." There was a murmur from Martin that Henry couldn't resolve into words. "No," Diana said. "Henry doesn't have that. He has technical facility. He can tell you whether a sentence is grammatically sound or structurally inconsistent. He cannot tell you whether it is alive. That's not a failure, it's just a limit. He'll be a line editor for the rest of his career, and he'll be a good one, and that's quite enough." Henry read the next sentence. It was the one about the orange cat that appeared on the back step of the house on the third morning after the funeral, sitting with the patience of a thing that had decided without being asked that it belonged there. Henry had put that cat in the book because his sister had had a cat like that, one that arrived from nowhere and stayed, and he had written the cat with the specific quality of attention you bring to something that is real. He finished page 3. He turned to page 4. The reading ended on page 4's final paragraph, the one about the daughter standing in the kitchen where the light had changed the colour of the wood to copper, holding the ceramic mug her mother had used every morning for 22 years, the mug with the small chip at the rim that her mother had never replaced, because the chip was there on the morning she was given it, and removing it would have been like removing a part of the morning itself. Henry read every word of that paragraph at the same pace he had read every word before it, and when he finished, he closed the book and set it on the lectern and stepped back. The room held the particular silence of people who are sitting with something rather than waiting to respond to it. Then the applause began. Henry carried the book back toward the row of chairs along the side wall. He did not look at Diana. He did not look at the doorway to the alcove. He sat down in the third chair and placed the book on the arm of the chair and looked at his hands, which were steady. Callum Voss was watching him. Henry became aware of this gradually, the way you become aware of a fixed point in peripheral vision. Callum had turned in his chair, not fully, not with the conspicuous angle of someone making a point of attention, but enough. His expression was not readable from a distance of 12 feet. Diana returned to the center of the room and thanked Henry by first name only, the way she thanked caterers, and then began her prepared remarks about the novel's structural achievement and Callum's use of interior distance as a narrative technique. Henry listened. The remarks were accurate and intelligent. Diana was a capable editor and an insightful reader of the work of other people. He had never doubted that. What he had doubted, after 2 years of sitting 2 floors below her, was whether she had ever once considered that the people correcting her marked pages had perspectives of their own, worth the price of a question. The remarks concluded with a round of questions from the guests. A literary agent who wanted to discuss the choice of first-person limited perspective, a reviewer who asked about the novel's relationship to a particular tradition of grief narrative, an academic from a nearby university press who asked a long and winding question about ecological metaphor that Henry thought contained about 3 questions and was phrased as one. Callum answered all of them with the same measured, slightly clipped courtesy. He did not over-explain. He did not fill silences. Then Callum turned, with a small, deliberate angle of his body, toward the chair where Henry was sitting. "I'd like to ask the reader something," he said. The room turned. Diana looked up from her notes. "The mug with the chip," Callum said. "Page 4. The daughter holds it at the end of the chapter. There's a specific reason that mug has a chip and not a crack. The writer made a choice there. I'm curious whether the reader caught it." Henry looked at him. He understood the question had a formal answer and an instinctive one. The formal answer would have been something about the difference between damage that compromises a thing's function and damage that doesn't. The chip as imperfection rather than failure. That would have been a competent editorial reading of the text. It was not the answer. The answer was that a crack is something that happens to you. A chip is something you keep. He said this, quietly and without performance, in the same level register he had used to read the 4 pages aloud. The room was still. Callum nodded once. "That's right," he said. He paused. "I want to tell you all something about this book." Diana set down her notepad. The literary agent looked up from her phone. Petra, who had been standing near the sideboard because Diana had also assigned Petra to logistics and Petra was conscientious about her assignments, looked at Henry with an expression Henry could not yet translate. Callum stood. It was not a theatrical movement. He simply stood the way a person stands when they have decided that what comes next requires it. "The novel was written by Henry Mitchell," Callum said. "He wrote it under a confidential agreement 3 years ago. His name is not on the cover. It should be." The particular quality of a room when a sentence lands in it that the room did not expect is a kind of pressure, something felt in the chest before it is processed by the mind. Henry felt it. He was sitting in the 3rd chair along the side wall, and he had known the sentence was coming in the quarter second before it arrived, and still it landed with a weight he had not prepared for. Diana said, "I don't understand what you mean." Her voice was careful. It was the voice she used in meetings when she was recalibrating, the voice of a person who has just received information that conflicts with a structure she has been relying on, and who is deciding quickly whether the structure can be maintained. It could not be maintained. "He wrote the manuscript," Callum said. "The story, the sentences, the cat on the back step, the chip in the mug, all of it. I came to the press 3 years ago with a framework and a reputation, and no manuscript. And Henry was the one who built what I did not have." He turned to look at Henry. "I structured the agreement to release him from the confidentiality clause at the time of my choosing. I chose tonight. I should have chosen sooner. That's a separate conversation. What I want you to know right now is that what you just heard, read aloud, was his. And the question I asked him was one I had no answer to myself, because I have never been able to explain the mug." He paused. He answered it in 1 sentence. Diana's notepad was still in her hands. She was looking at it rather than at Callum, which Henry recognized as the behavior of someone who is taking a moment to decide what to look at when they look up. Martin Cole, standing just inside the alcove doorway now, had the expression of a man reviewing a conversation he had had 20 minutes ago and locating several things in it he would have phrased differently. The literary agent said, to no one in particular, "Henry Mitchell. The credit reads Callum Voss." "The cover reads Callum Voss," Callum said. "That's what I'm addressing." The room had settled into a new configuration, the way a room settles after a window is opened and the air changes. The same 14 people, the same sconce light, the same wine in the glasses, and a different understanding of what had happened in it. Henry looked at the book on the arm of his chair. He had not let himself pick it up and read it since it was published. He had bought a copy the week it came out and carried it home from the bookshop 2 blocks from his apartment and sat with it in his lap on the sofa without opening it. He had set it on his bookshelf with the spine facing out. He had looked at the name on the spine sometimes when he was reaching for something else, and he had felt the particular weight of a thing that is true and unspoken, and stored somewhere you have to walk past every day. He picked up the copy from the arm of the chair now. It was warm from having been held during the reading. He turned it over in his hands and looked at the cover. Diana said, "Henry." She said it in a register he had not heard from her before, which was not quite an apology and not quite an acknowledgement, but sat in the territory between them, the voice of someone who has just been asked to see something they had decided in advance not to look at. Henry looked up at her. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. It was not quite a question. It was the kind of sentence that sounds like a question, but is actually a statement wearing a question's clothes, the statement being that she had not known, and that not knowing had been, in some part, her own design. Henry said, "You didn't ask." It was the simplest sufficient sentence. It was also true. Diana looked at him. The reading glasses on their chain rested against her collarbone, and she was holding the notepad with both hands now, and she had the expression of a person standing in a room that has been rearranged without her permission, trying to locate where the furniture used to be. Petra crossed from the sideboard to where Henry was sitting. She did not say anything. She sat down in the chair beside him, the fourth chair along the wall, and put her hands in her lap. And her presence in that chair was the particular presence of someone who has been waiting to make a declaration of loyalty and has finally found the moment. Henry had worked with Petra for 18 months. She had twice caught continuity errors in manuscripts he had missed, told him about them quietly and without ceremony, and then gone back to her own work. She had brought him coffee once when he was in the middle of a deadline, and she noticed he hadn't moved from his desk in 3 hours. He had thanked her, and she had said, "I know how you take it," which was the kind of small fact that registers as kindness. He was glad she was there. Callum crossed the room. He moved the way he had moved in the elevator alcove when he took back his manuscript pages, with the unhurried directness of someone who has thought about where they are going. He stopped in front of Henry and extended his hand. Henry stood. He shook it. "I know the agreement didn't give you this," Callum said. "That was by design at the time. My design, not just the contracts. I want to say that clearly." Henry held that sentence for a moment. He had thought about the agreement's design more than once in 3 years, usually in the particular late-night hour when the things you have decided not to think about come to sit with you anyway. He had concluded, in the end, that the agreement had been what he needed it to be at the time, and that conclusions about fairness and exploitation are easier to reach when the expense is not your sister's hospital bill. What Callum was saying now was that the agreement had been structured with a release clause, that Henry had been capable of being freed from it, that Callum had been deciding when. He had questions about that. They were not small questions. They were questions he would ask in a different room, on a different night, when 14 people were not sitting in a crescent arrangement, watching his face. "Thank you," Henry said. It was not the whole thing he felt. It was the portion of it that belonged in this room. Callum looked at him with an expression that acknowledged the partial nature of the thanks, and did not ask for more. Diana had crossed toward the window. She was standing where Callum had been standing at the beginning of the evening, in the pool of sconce light, and she was looking out at the wet street below with the stillness of a person who is not looking at the street. The guests had begun to move, small conversations forming and reforming, the particular social movement of a room in which something has happened, and no one is yet sure how to name it. Martin Cole came to stand near the lectern. He looked at Henry with an expression that was half professional and half genuinely taken aback. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for a conversation I had in the alcove 20 minutes ago that you may or may not have heard." "I heard it," Henry said. I thought as much. He looked down at the lectern, at the place where the book had rested. The Harwich Prize will want to know about this. The committee asks about authorship as part of the long list process. Henry said, "That's between you and Callum." Martin nodded. "And you," he said, "whether you want it to be or not." Henry looked at the book in his hands. The prize was not the thing he had wanted when he wrote the novel. What he had wanted in the evenings at the small table and the library and the long Saturdays when the sentences came slowly and required patience was to write a book that was the best version of itself. He had done that. The book existed. It was the book he had made it. Whether his name went on it now was a question that belonged to agreements and committees and processes he did not entirely control. He understood this. He had understood it when he signed. What had changed in the last 20 minutes was that 14 people in this room now knew what he had made. One of them was Petra, who had brought him coffee and knew how he took it. One of them was Callum, who had read the manuscript he delivered and recognized what it was. One of them was Diana, who was standing at the window and looking at the street and deciding something Henry could not see the shape of yet. He was not in the same room he had entered at 6:30 with a clipboard and a box of name cards. He was in the same room, which was different. Petra leaned over and said, quietly, "The cat." He looked at her. "She appeared on page 47 as well," Petra said. "I read it twice. I thought it was an error. I flagged it in the copy edit and someone removed the flag and I never knew why." She paused. "She comes back in the last chapter too. I thought the continuity was slightly loose. It isn't loose, is it?" "No," Henry said. "She's the same cat. She's the same cat." Petra was quiet for a moment. "I kept thinking there was something I was missing," she said, "about the way that book held together. I read a lot of manuscripts. I know when something is stitched and when it grew. That book grew." She looked at him directly. "I should have asked you about it sooner." "You didn't know to ask," Henry said. "I knew something," she said. "I just didn't know what." Across the room, Diana turned from the window. She looked at Henry. It was not the look she used when she was finding a problem and marking it. It was a different look, slower and more effortful, the look of someone learning to see a thing they had trained themselves to see past. She crossed the room toward him and Petra, and the guests parted in the quiet, natural way of people who understand that a conversation is happening that requires space. "The quarterly review," Diana said. She said it the way you say the name of a document you have had in a drawer for too long. "I gave you a rating of meeting expectations in the creative judgment category. I've given you that rating for 3 consecutive cycles." Henry said, "You have." "That rating is," she said, and stopped. She looked at the notepad in her hands as if it had said something she needed to verify. "It's incorrect." It was the smallest possible version of an acknowledgement. It contained no warmth and no drama and no apology in the conventional form. It was the calibrated minimum of a woman whose currency was judgment, conceding in public that a specific judgment had been wrong. It was enough. It was, Henry thought, exactly the kind of sentence that doesn't say everything but says the thing that matters. And he had written several of those, and he knew one when he heard it. He nodded once. Diana nodded once. Petra looked from one of them to the other with the expression of a person watching something be resolved in a language she can follow, but is not required to translate. The evening continued around them in the way evenings do when a central event has passed, and the room has absorbed it and returned to the ordinary motions of people finishing wine and finding their coats. Callum spoke to the literary agent for a long time near the sideboard. Martin Cole made notes in a small leather notebook. 2 guests who had not spoken before the reading found each other in conversation near the window, talking about the book with the specific energy of people who have just been given new information about a thing they thought they already knew. Henry carried the book home that night. He rode the bus, which was nearly empty, and sat by the window with the book in his lap. The wet streetlights reflected on the glass beside him. He held the book with both hands, not reading it, just holding it, the way you hold something you have made and set down and come back to find. And the feeling of it was not triumph, and not relief in the conventional sense, but the particular settling of something that has been held at an angle for 3 years, returning to level. He got off at his stop. He walked the 2 blocks to his building, the book under his arm. The October air was cold and had the smell of rain that had stopped a few hours ago and left the pavement dark and reflective. He went upstairs to his apartment. He went to the bookshelf. He took out the copy he had bought 2 years ago and set it on the table. He stood the 2 copies side by side on the shelf, one he had bought and one from Diana's salon, where someone had set copies out for guests, and he looked at the spine of both of them. The radiator knocked. He went to the kitchen and filled the kettle and put it on. And while it heated, he stood at the table and opened his copy of the book to page 1 and read the first sentence, the one about the morning light coming through the kitchen window and what it did to the colour of the wood. And he read it in the quiet of his own apartment, with no one watching, and it was the same sentence it had always been, which was his, and which was good, and which was finally, plainly, undeniably known to be both. If you are watching and you know this kind of quiet, the kind that comes when something long unspoken is finally heard by the right person at the right moment, consider leaving a comment below. This channel keeps making stories for people who recognize that feeling from the inside. The kettle reached its temperature and clicked off. Henry poured the water and left the tea to steep on the counter and went back to the window, the book still in his hand. The street below was the same street. He stood there for a while in the low light of his own room, the book held loosely at his side. And the copper-coloured weight of what he had written and what he had endured and what had finally, without ceremony, been named settled through him like October light through kitchen glass, slow and warm, and exactly the colour it had always been.